You've heard of the Great Escape, the daring tunnel that promised freedom to Allied airmen in World War II. But there was another story, a story with no tunnels, no planes, and no chance of rescue. Only 6,000 men walking through ice and hunger, trying not to fall behind. It began in the last winter of the war, February 1945. Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing in from the east, and every German road was filled with refugees, soldiers, and prisoners. In a camp called Stalag Luft IV, near the village of Gross Tychow in Pomerania, thousands of Allied airmen were locked behind barbed wire. They had survived crashes, capture, and months of captivity. Most were in their early 20s, gunners, pilots, engineers, waiting for the war to end so they could go home. Then one morning, the guards shouted an order: "Pack your things, we march west." No one understood why. The front was moving fast, the war could be over in weeks. But the prisoners had no choice. They wrapped blankets around their shoulders, tied rags over worn-out boots, and stepped into the freezing snow. That first day was silent. No songs, no talk, only the crunch of ice under thousands of boots. Each man carried a small bundle, a tin cup, a spoon, maybe a photograph. They didn't know where they were going or how long it would take, only that if they stopped, they would be left behind. One diary wrote, "We marched into a white world that had forgotten us." For the next 3 months, through snow, mud, and hunger, these 6,000 men would walk nearly 500 miles across a dying Germany. Some would never reach the end. Others would see moments of kindness they could not forget: a loaf of bread thrown from a farmhouse window, a guard who looked away when someone fell. This is not a story about victory or escape. It's a story about endurance and about what people discover when everything else is taken away. By early 1945, Germany was falling apart. The Eastern Front had collapsed. The Red Army was less than 100 miles away. Every village in Pomerania shook with the sound of distant artillery. Civilians were fleeing west with horses, wagons, and whatever they could carry. And in the middle of all that chaos stood Stalag Luft IV, a prison camp built for Allied airmen. Inside were more than 6,000 men, Americans, British, Canadians, and a few from Australia and Poland. Most had been shot down over Germany the previous year. They had survived bailouts, interrogation, and months of hunger. The camp was a rough collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. It was cold, dirty, and overcrowded, but at least it was still. The prisoners had built a kind of fragile routine: roll call, thin soup, Red Cross parcels when they came, letters from home when they didn't get lost. Some even kept small journals, writing in pencil on scraps of paper. Then, in early February, rumors started to spread. Someone had heard the guards talking. "The Russians are close, too close." At night, men could see red flashes on the eastern horizon, the front line moving toward them. One evening, the camp commandant received orders from higher up. "All prisoners are to be evacuated immediately. March them west." No one questioned the logic. In the panic of Germany's final weeks, every POW camp in the east was told to move. The guards feared that if the Russians arrived first, they would be overrun, or worse. So the next morning, the command came down: "Line up, we're leaving." It didn't matter that it was still below freezing. It didn't matter that most men had no winter boots or proper coats. They were told they'd march for a few days, just until the front passes. No one realized it would last 86 days and cover nearly 500 miles. The guards were as unprepared as the prisoners. Many were old men or boys of 16 pulled from the home guard. They carried old rifles, short rations, and the same confusion as everyone else. They didn't know where the march would end, only that they had to keep the prisoners moving and away from the Russians. A diary from that week reads, "We were given one slice of bread, a little cheese, and told to move out. The snow was deep. The wind burned our faces. Behind us, we could hear the war catching up. The march began in lines of 3. 6,000 men trudging west across frozen fields. From above, it might have looked like a long black trail winding through white countryside, a column of ghosts disappearing into the cold. No trucks, no wagons, only what they could carry on their backs. Some still believed this was temporary, that they'd be loaded on trains soon. Others whispered that the Germans were trying to use them as shields, hoping Allied planes wouldn't bomb a road filled with POWs. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: the road west would test every man's strength, every friendship, and every bit of faith they still had left. They called it an evacuation, one survivor wrote, but it was really the beginning of our longest march. It was still dark when the order came. Out of the barracks, line up in the compound. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Men wrapped their blankets around their shoulders, pulled socks over their hands, and stepped outside into the cold. In front of them stood rows of guards, rifles slung across their backs, breath steaming in the icy air. No one shouted, no one explained, just a simple command: march west. 6,000 prisoners began to move. 3 men across, hundreds of columns deep, a line that stretched far beyond the camp gates. They passed the watchtowers one last time, the searchlights off, the snow crunching under worn boots. Behind them, Stalag Luft IV disappeared into the gray morning mist. For many, that first mile felt like freedom. At least they were moving. But within hours, the weight of the cold began to crush that feeling. The wind came hard off the Baltic Sea. Snow fell sideways, stinging their faces and covering the road in a thick white crust. Every breath burned. Every step was work. Each man carried what little he could: a thin blanket, a dented mess tin, maybe a photograph folded in a pocket. The lucky ones still had Red Cross gloves or scraps of chocolate from old parcels. Most had nothing. One prisoner later wrote, "We looked like scarecrows walking through the snow, wrapped in rags, limping, half-starved. I remember thinking, this is what ghosts must look like." The guards walked beside them, not much better off. Some were middle-aged reservists, others were teenage recruits. Their boots were cracked, their uniforms thin. When they stopped at night, both guards and prisoners crowded into barns or ditches, trying to find a place out of the wind. They slept sitting up, too cold to lie down. Food was already a problem. Each man had been given a small ration, a slice of bread, a bit of cheese, maybe a potato if they were lucky. There were no supply wagons following them. After the second day, men started trading cigarettes for crumbs, melting snow in their tins just to have something warm to swallow. On the third night, they reached a small village. The people stood at their doors and watched the column pass. One old woman crossed herself and turned away. Another slipped out quietly, dropping a loaf of bread into the snow when the guards weren't looking. A man at the back of the column picked it up and tore it into pieces, passing it down the line without a word. That moment, a single loaf shared among dozens, became a kind of miracle in their memories. It reminded them that the world beyond the wire still had mercy left in it. By the end of the first week, frostbite had set in. Toes turned black. Men walked in silence, focused only on the boots in front of them. Some prayed, some cursed, some just kept their heads down and moved. And this was only the beginning. In the next weeks, hunger would become their constant companion. And yet, in the middle of all that suffering, they would find small acts of kindness that kept them alive. By the second week, hunger had become a living thing. It followed them like a shadow, quiet, patient, and always there. The men were now deep inside northern Germany. The snow was still thick, the sky a dull gray that never seemed to brighten. They had been walking for 10 days. Their boots, what was left of them, were frozen hard, soles cracked open like old wood. Some men wrapped rags around their feet. Others used pieces of wire to hold their shoes together. Each morning started the same way. A guard shouted, "Raus! Out!" The men stood, stiff and shivering, then began another day of walking west. Food was nearly gone. Their rations had been cut again, a slice of bread, sometimes nothing at all. When they stopped in villages, they searched the ground for frozen turnips or animal feed. A few men learned to scrape the ice from stable walls, melting it to drink. It wasn't enough. One prisoner wrote later, "The hunger was worse than the cold. You could fight the cold by moving, but hunger waited for you, even in your sleep." As the days dragged on, small acts of kindness began to appear, quiet, fleeting, but unforgettable. In one village, a farmer's wife stepped outside her barn with a basket. Inside were pieces of dark bread, still warm. She looked around, saw no officer near, and quickly tossed it toward the road. A dozen hands reached down at once, tearing it apart before the guards noticed. For a moment, those men smiled, the first real smile in days. Later, near a churchyard, a German soldier walking with the guards slipped something from his pocket. It was a small piece of sausage wrapped in paper. He passed it to a young American without looking at him. Neither spoke. They just nodded, one man to another, both trapped in the same winter. Not every guard was cruel. Many were simply exhausted. They too were hungry, scared, and unsure which side would find them first, the British or the Russians. Sometimes they looked at the prisoners and saw a reflection of themselves. One night, as the column camped inside an empty factory, a storm hit. Snow blew through the broken windows, covering the floor. A British prisoner shared his blanket with a sick man from Canada. Someone started humming a hymn, soft at first, then joined by others. It wasn't a song of hope. It was a song to stay human. By early March, sickness spread through the march. Dysentery, frostbite, pneumonia. Those who couldn't walk were loaded onto small carts, pulled by other prisoners until the carts broke. When a man died, they buried him by the roadside. No ceremony, just a shallow grave under the snow. And yet, in the middle of all this, there was still kindness. A stranger's loaf of bread, a guard who looked away, a friend who refused to leave another behind. In a war built on cruelty, these small mercies became their light, proof that even here, the human heart could survive. By March, winter was starting to fade, but not the suffering. The snow melted into mud, and every road became a swamp. Their frozen boots turned to soggy leather, heavy with water. Every step felt like dragging a stone. The men had now been walking for nearly a month. They didn't count the days anymore. They counted villages, each one a promise of a short rest, maybe a bit of food, maybe shelter from the wind. Most times, they found none of it. When they reached a barn, they'd collapse inside, too tired to talk. The smell of wet straw, smoke, and sickness filled the air. Lice crawled everywhere. The sound of coughing never stopped. In the morning, someone would always be missing. One diary entry said simply, "Another night, 3 gone. I can't feel my feet." They called it the Road of Ghosts, because as the weeks went on, that's what they became. Thin, hollow, silent shapes moving through the fog. The only color left was the rust brown of their coats and the gray sky above them. Sometimes the column split into smaller groups, each heading in different directions to avoid the fighting. German officers argued about which way to go. One day they were marching south, the next day north again. No one seemed to know who was in charge anymore. The guards were breaking down too. Many threw away their rifles or limped along without saying a word. A few slipped into villages and never came back. The prisoners didn't chase them, they just kept walking. Freedom didn't mean much if you couldn't stand. Somewhere near the town of Neubrandenburg, Allied planes flew overhead. The men looked up and waved their arms, desperate, hoping to be seen. But the planes passed without slowing. To them, the column below looked like another line of German soldiers. Food was gone again. They boiled grass and roots. They chewed on the leather straps from their packs. One man tried to eat a candle he'd found in a church ruin. Another cut his blanket into strips, thinking he could trade it for bread. There was no bread left to trade. Yet somehow they kept moving. And through all of it, something strange happened. The guards and prisoners began to help each other. A German guard shared a cigarette with an American airman. A British sergeant carried a young German boy who had collapsed from fever. The war outside was ending, but on this road there were no sides left, just human beings trying to survive another day. A survivor later wrote, "We no longer marched for them, we marched for each other." That line would appear in many accounts after the war. It captured what the march had become, not an escape, not a punishment, but a test of how far compassion could go when everything else was stripped away. As April began, the air grew warmer. The snow was gone, replaced by rain and mud. Somewhere to the west, they could hear artillery again. Not Russian this time, but Allied guns. Hope stirred, fragile but real. They didn't know it yet, but the road was almost over. Only a few more weeks stood between them and the end of the war. By early April, the world around them had changed. Winter had finally broken. The snow was gone, the trees were turning green again, but for the men of the march, the landscape still felt gray. They had been walking for nearly 2 months. Most weighed less than 100 pounds. Their clothes hung loose, their faces hollow. But ahead, they began to hear a new sound, deep, rolling thunder that didn't come from the sky. It was artillery, and it was getting closer. The guards grew restless. They whispered among themselves, glancing over their shoulders. Everyone could sense it. The war was collapsing. The Germans were retreating in every direction, trying to avoid capture. No one knew who would reach them first, the British from the west or the Russians from the east. One evening, as the column passed through a small village, a group of German civilians stood silently on the roadside. No insults, no shouting, just blank faces, some afraid, some ashamed. A young boy offered a tin cup of water to a prisoner. A guard looked at him, then quietly nodded. No one spoke. That night, they slept in a barn near Fallingbostel, a town that had once been home to another POW camp. The men were too weak to move. Some couldn't stand at all. When morning came, the guards were gone. They had slipped away in the dark, leaving their rifles in the straw. For a long moment, no one knew what to do. Were they free? Was it a trick? The men sat there, listening, and then, faintly, They heard it again, engines in the distance. The sound grew louder, metal tracks grinding over the road. A tank, British markings, moving carefully through the mist. A soldier leaned out and waved. Someone shouted, "They're ours!" And just like that, the march was over. Some men laughed, some cried. Others just stood there in silence, unable to believe it. One diary said, "When freedom came, most of us couldn't even walk to greet it. We just watched it arrive." British medics gave them chocolate, tea, and cigarettes. Many were too sick to eat. Doctors later recorded frostbite, pneumonia, dysentery, and exhaustion beyond words, but they were alive. Out of the thousands who had left Stalag Luft IV in February, hundreds had died along the way. No one knew exactly how many. Over the next days, trucks carried survivors to Allied camps. They were washed, fed, and given clean uniforms. Some finally wrote letters home, shaky, brief messages that began the same way: "I'm alive." Still, freedom felt strange. After months of captivity and the endless march, silence was almost unbearable. Many men said they couldn't sleep without hearing footsteps or the crunch of snow. One survivor later reflected, "When the British tanks came, I thought I'd feel joy, but what I felt was peace, a quiet I hadn't known since before the war." They had walked more than 500 miles across a dying nation. They had seen cruelty, kindness, and everything in between. And now, at last, the road had ended. But what they discovered on that road, about courage, compassion, and the human spirit, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But for the men who had survived the Stalag Luft IV march, the echoes would last a lifetime. They had walked through the final winter of the Third Reich. 6,000 Allied airmen turned wanderers in a collapsing world. They had seen the empire of their captors crumble mile by mile. They had buried friends by the roadside, shared crusts of bread with strangers, and learned that sometimes survival wasn't about strength, it was about kindness. After the war, many of them tried to forget. They went home, built lives, raised families, and rarely spoke about the march. To some, it felt too painful. To others, it felt too unbelievable, like something no one who hadn't been there could truly understand. But in letters and old diaries, their words remained. Fragments of memory, quiet and plain, but filled with meaning. One wrote, "I thought freedom would come with cheering and flags. It came with silence. And in that silence, I realized how much we had lost, and how much we had found." What they had found wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was a kind of truth that even in the darkest moments of war, humanity can survive. They discovered that the enemy could show mercy, that a piece of bread could be an act of defiance, that hope could live in the smallest of gestures. A song hummed in a frozen barn, a hand held over a dying friend, a guard looking the other way. One man said years later, "The march taught me that courage isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the man beside you, still walking when every step hurts." For historians, the Stalag Luft IV march became one of the least known tragedies of the war, overshadowed by battles and victories. But for those who lived it, it was the longest lesson in endurance ever written on foot. Even now, in the villages they passed, some people still remember. Old farmers tell of giving bread to thin young men who thanked them in broken German. Children remember their parents whispering, "Don't let the soldiers see." The war moved on, but those brief moments of compassion stayed behind. Today, few of the survivors are still alive. Those who are speak softly about it, not with anger, but with awe. Awe that they endured. Awe that they saw kindness when the world seemed to have none left. History remembers wars for their battles and their heroes. But sometimes the truest stories are about the ones who simply kept walking. They didn't choose this march. They didn't win it or lose it. They survived it. And in doing so, they showed the world what endurance really means. One of them wrote, near the end of his diary, "We discovered that even in the coldest winter of war, humanity had not frozen." And that is what 6,000 airmen discovered on the march from Stalag Luft IV.